one step further. And we were supposed to understand that the thrust of his Murphy-Brown remarks was black illegitimacy, or at least a large part of the thrust of his Murphy-Brown remarks was black illegitimacy. So what happens is nobody talks about race in presidential campaigns, but race exercises a powerful force because all of these coded messages are being given out. Even the Willie Horton ad in 1988 didn't mention race, obviously. So serious attention to race is already absent from U.S. politics, and it is the right wing, not the Democrats, not the left, which benefits. But, and here's where the Clinton forces make their most serious argument. They say, or at least leftists involved in the Clinton campaign say, might the positive content of economic reform programs gradually win white voters away from their racism, opening the way for experience in campaigns which cut across racial lines and which teach people that race ought not to divide workers. I don't want to be heard as dismissing that out of hand. I think it's a very powerful argument. Obviously, we need black-white economic coalitions, especially based around the labor movement. We can't do without them. So I grant that it's a serious argument. And in fact, my own work tries to argue that one of the main reasons that people choose to think of themselves as white, that workers choose to think of themselves as white, is because they're so miserable and powerless and alienated on their jobs. And so obviously things that we do to get around that alienation, some of you will know Frederick Jameson's great article, Reification and Utopia in Mass Culture. He makes the same argument, that the alienation produced by bureaucratic structures, by alienated work, by commercialized culture, helps to make white people think they're white, or specifically think they're white ethnics. And so if we can beat back that alienation a little bit, sure, it opens the door to people questioning racism as well. That's all kind of fancy stuff with academics' names thrown in. Let me make it concrete. In 1991, when the former Klansman, current Klansman, David Duke, ran for the governorship of Louisiana, USA Today interviewed one of his female supporters, and in the midst of her litany of blacks on welfare myths, including they get new cars every year, you know, she added, in fact, she concluded her comments, "The state won't take care of me." And I think that's I think we should listen to what poor whites, working class whites are saying about race, because I think it often contains very profound truths amidst a lot of lies and distortions. But the state won't take care of me. Now, perhaps if there were a large militant movement for decent health care, that woman might join it. She might make demands on the state to take care of her. She might gain a sense of power, and in the course of struggle alongside the black poor, she might begin to question the myths about welfare that she now recites. So I'm not sneering at that. And those of you who are campaigning for Clinton, I'm not even sneering at that, although I think we need to have our eyes open and be critical as well. It would be hard to imagine a successful assault on white supremacy which did not include millions of such small miracles as that Duke supporter joining a health care coalition, and which did not include a rallying around pressing class issues. But what's problematic is when theorists, political leaders, policy experts tend to assume that a rediscovered emphasis on economic issues clarifies all or even most of the questions of political strategy where race and class are concerned. I'm a historian, and I guess I haven't said anything historical yet. But the historical record of attempts to build these class coalitions is really not great in the U.S. And one of the things if we looked at that historical record, one of the things we'd notice is that the people who learn to cooperate in black-white coalitions often unlearn it as well. So that the populists, for example, who you'll hear about in your American history courses, the great farm radicals of the 1890s, in the early 1890s, they learned beautifully that, as their leader Tom Watson puts it, the black sheep and the white sheep will stand together or they'll all be fleeced together. But then he unlearns it, and he leads lynch mobs in the early 20th century, and the populists turn back to racism, many of them, by the early 20th century. The Knights of Labor, you'll read about as a great example, and it was a great example, of black-white trade union unity. At the last convention, after experiencing defeat, and as it was getting smaller, at its last convention, the Knights of Labor resolved to favor deportation of all black Americans from the United States. So they learned the lessons of black-white unity, but then they unlearned them. And we shouldn't imagine that there's anything magical about class that lets it just dissolve these notions of race well and truly and for good. Why there are prospects for a better outcome in a new effort at class-oriented reform, which minimizes emphasis on racial justice, has not been made clear, especially given that the substance of the reforms, the tiny reforms on offer from Clinton and the Democratic Party currently, hardly are the stuff that great transformations of consciousness are made of. I just don't see how we can be certain that a class-based movement, an economically based movement, is going to lead down the road to racial justice or to class justice for that matter. Let me make one other point in the second section, and then I'll go on to the third. And I guess I'm speaking a little bit as a historian again here. In many cases, the very ways that people think about their class position in the United States is so defined by race that it would be impossible for us to just talk about class even if we wanted to just talk about class. And I'll just give two examples from New Jersey. David Holla, the sociologist who just did a study of chemical workers in New Jersey, found that white male chemical workers identify themselves as working men or as middle class. They tend to see their white neighbors as being like them in class terms, as working men and middle class, whether their neighbors are workers or not. They see black workers who have the same jobs as they do as being, as they put it, intruders and loafers, even if the black workers share their job and share their membership in the union. Well, here, race is framing the way that people think about class. So we can't just say, oh, let's talk about class. We have to address the way that people are seeing the world in terms of race if we're going to get a clear class picture to emerge. Second New Jersey example is by an anthropologist named Catherine Newman, who interviewed a lot of white former factory workers whose plant had closed in Elizabeth, New Jersey. It was a Singer sewing machine plant. And many of the workers, the plant had closed and moved to, I think, to Mexico. It may have been to Taiwan. Many of the white workers processed this terrible class experience by arguing that the employer was forced to leave because it was impossible to turn profits while having to employ blacks and Hispanics. So here are people who have just experienced something that you would think would radicalize them on class grounds for sure. Their plant is picked up and run away to the third world, and they're without jobs, and yet the way that they frame that is to say, well, the poor bosses couldn't make a profit because of fair hiring laws, and they had to hire blacks and Hispanics, and therefore they couldn't make a go of it. Well, you can't separate race and class in a situation like that. There's just no way to talk about one without talking about the other. Nearly a half a century ago, the great Trinidadian theorist C.L.R. James, living in Detroit, critiqued the traditional left strategy in the U.S. on race and class by writing, "Black and white unite and fight is unimpeachable in principle. It's fine in principle, but it is often misleading and sometimes even offensive in the face of the infinitely varied, tumultuous, passionate, and often murderous reality of race relations in the United States." And I think that that's something that we have to bear in mind as we form a strategy. That it's not enough to just say, well, blacks and whites should get together and just talk about class. We have got to also talk about race if we want to move forward. Third section, and I'll be brief. I want to consider then what kind of strategy we do develop, and to make the case that I identified as a rather extravagant case at the beginning, and that is that we ought to question whiteness and even to, I don't know what I want to call it. I think we should at least be non-white. We should at least try to be non-whites. Maybe anti-white isn't quite the right word. But what I want to argue is that there's a chance that this country can see a withering away of whiteness, and that we ought to do everything that we can to make that happen. When Americans talk about race, they too often talk only about blacks, about Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. If whites are discussed, it's only because whites have attitudes toward people of color. We don't think about white as being, white people don't have race in this country. They might be racist, but they don't have race. And one of the best things about the recent scholarship on race is that it begins to call that into question. One feminist scholar has recently written, "Racial identities are not only black, Latin, Latino, Asian, Native American, and so on, they are also white. And to ignore white ethnicity is to redouble it by making it seem natural." So I'll argue that to make the fullest possible contribution to the growth of a new society, activism which draws on these new ideas about social construction of race must focus its political energies on exposing, demystifying, and demeaning the idea of whiteness, rather than just calling the concept of race into question generally. And I want to make three brief points. The first is that while neither whiteness nor blackness is a scientific or natural racial category, the former, whiteness, is infinitely more false, and because it's false, more dangerous than the latter. Whiteness is more dangerous than blackness. The second is that in attacking the notion that whiteness and blackness are the same, we specifically undermine what has become, through the notion of reverse racism, a major argument among whites who are refusing to face racism and refusing to face themselves. And the last is that whiteness can actually be defeated, that it's brittle and fragile right now, and it can be fought successfully. By far the best modern analysis of whiteness comes in the unlikely form of an essay only 2 pages long in a lifestyle magazine. Writing in Essence, the Black Lifestyle magazine, in 1984, James Baldwin reflected, as the title of his article put it, on being white and other lies. And he immediately put his finger on what sets whiteness apart as an American social phenomenon. It's the most important thing I'll say tonight. It's not my words, it's Baldwin's words. Quote, "The crisis of leadership in the white community is remarkable and terrifying," Baldwin began, "because there is, in fact, no white community. The crisis of leadership in the white community is remarkable and terrifying because there is, in fact, no white community." Now, in that, it's not merely that whiteness is oppressive and false. It's that whiteness is nothing but oppressive and false. There's no other content to white civilization or white culture. We speak of African American culture and community, and rightly. We might speak of blacks as an African American ethnic group. We might speak of an African American nation. But clearly there's an African American culture and African American experience. whites, none of those things quite work when we begin to talk about whites. There's an American culture, surely, that white people participate in, so-called white people. There's an American culture, but it's thoroughly mulatto, to borrow Albert Murray's fine description. If there's a Southern culture, it's still more thoroughly mulatto than the general American culture. There are Irish-American songs, and there are Italian-American neighborhoods, and Slavic-American traditions, and German-American food, unfortunately, and so on. But such specific ethnic cultures always stand in danger of being swallowed up. They're real, but they always stand in danger of being swallowed up by the lie of whiteness. There's no white culture. There's no white civilization. There's no white community. Find it. Go looking for it. Even in Ames, you're not going to be able to find it. Whiteness describes, from Little Bighorn to Los Angeles, not a culture, but precisely the absence of culture. It is the empty and therefore terrifying attempt to build an identity based on what one isn't and on whom one can hold back. Almost no left initiatives have challenged white workers to critique and much less to abandon whiteness. Baldwin's wonderful comment in the film The Price of the Ticket, and also in the essay that I read from at the beginning, that as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. Hopefully this time through that comment makes a little more sense to you. As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. That seems more like poetry than politics to radicals who have so long confined their struggles to encouraging whites to unite with blacks and who have found it difficult to disarm racism, much less to think of abolishing whiteness. But a highly poetic politics is just what is required in a situation in which workers who identify themselves as white are bound to retreat from genuine class unity and from meaningful anti-racism. In a fascinating 1974 essay outlining the precondition for the emergence of a united radical labor movement, Sivanandan, writing in Britain, defied usual formulations of the relationship between race and class, writing, "In recovering its sense of oppression," quote, "in recovering its sense of oppression both from technological alienation and from a white-oriented culture, the white working class must arrive at a consciousness of racial oppression." Complicated stuff. In recovering its sense of oppression from technological alienation and from a white-oriented culture, the white working class must arrive at a consciousness of racial oppression. In other words, here's this black Indian theorist saying what we need is for white workers to begin to feel that whiteness is oppressing them. That's when we'll know that we're ready for a united and radical labor movement. When white workers realize that their whiteness is a weight and it's not a valuable thing to have. If it does not involve a critique of whiteness, the questioning of racism often proves shallow and limited. Indeed, at this horrifying moment in race relations, most whites describe themselves as not racist. Even David Duke packages his white supremacy as a National Association for the Advancement of White People, allowing supporters to feel that, as one of them told USA Today, they are only doing, quote, the same thing, end quote, as blacks in the NAACP. Open Klan members in St. Louis now describe their organization as not racist, but merely. Now, in St. Louis also, young whites call blacks nigger on the non-racist ground that they are describing behavior and not genetics. Black guys are nice and polite, they reason, but niggers are pests. It's easy to regard such rationales as pure hypocrisy, especially in David Duke's mouth. But we should also face the fact that many whites genuinely feel absolved from being what they would call bigots or racists. To most white students, these terms imply being an extremist or being violent or being worse than average, and most students are sure that they're not any of those things. I think most students would say that they know racist, but they're not racist. But everybody knows they're white. And all of you think you know that you're white. So I say that the place to begin is with this idea of whiteness, and then we move to racism. The destructive term reverse racism grows out of this assurance among whites that they have transcended race. They're sure that they see the world based on merit and behavior, while affirmative action officers, left-wing professors, Native American fishermen, black nationalists, and pointy-headed liberals bring in race. An analysis which simply gets rid of race as a category without concentrating on critiquing whiteness runs the risk of reinforcing such widely held notions about reverse racism, that blackness and whiteness are just the same. Final point. Indeed, the whole struggle against the concept of reverse racism is terribly difficult if we fail to question whiteness and instead stay on the traditional terrain of left liberal politics. Whenever we do this, conservatives creepily quote Dr. King, obscuring the fact that King was himself an advocate of affirmative action, and they say, whether it's George Will or George Bush, it doesn't matter much who's talking, they say that they're the real believers in Dr. King's dream. And they say, we want a world that's based on raceless standards and on, quote, the content of one's character. King's most famous line, perhaps. We try to argue back from history. We say, yeah, but let's look at history. Let's look at the history of black oppression. But we're really arguing to people who aren't very interested in history in a lot of cases. We hold that racism implies the power to dominate, and that since people of color lack such power, reverse racism is not a useful term. And this perfectly valid point falls on deaf ears to the extent that the firmest believers in reverse racism are often just those whites who are most convinced of their own powerlessness. These aren't powerful feeling people. They're people who are feeling overpowered by white elites and, they think, by blacks benefiting from affirmative action. And very often when we try to have these discussions, they end up with the professor or the liberal or whoever talking, saying, the last comment begins, but you refuse to see. At that point, you know that nobody's talking to each other and nobody's listening to each other. Those feeling victimized by reverse racism do see. They see in just the way and with just the blind spots that assurance that they are white but not racist and have white interests demands that they see. In the Simi Valley trial, the Rodney King case, the jurors saw Rodney King down and being kicked, but as one juror put it, somehow still, quote, in control of the situation. While he was on the ground, the feet were hitting him, the jurors' account of that was King was in control of that situation. Well, that's a kind of seeing, but with certain distortions. When Bill Clinton signaled his whiteness by using his appearance before the Rainbow Coalition to attack the rapper Sister Souljah, he hoped to appeal to the way that many whites see, or maybe he just saw that way. He railed against Sister Souljah's comment that it was unremarkable that black youth in South Central in L.A. who attack and kill each other all year would consider doing the same to whites for a week. Now, if any of you have had introductory sociology courses, what Sister Souljah was saying is no more than a sort of first introductory lesson in sociology. I mean, obviously, it's true that if that's the standard in the community, it is unremarkable that there'd be a turning on whites. Souljah's comment itself was no more than a simple exercise in common sense or introductory sociology. But Clinton offered a soundbite comparing Sister Souljah to David Duke. His demand that listeners imagine that the situation were reversed and that Duke made a statement like Souljah's was on one level absolutely perfect, total nonsense. Think about it. What would the reverse be? Would David Duke go to Beverly Hills or to Simi Valley and say that it is unremarkable that whites who attack each other all year would attack blacks for a week? The situation hasn't a reverse. Police don't single out white youths for racial harassment and brutality. Or if they do, it's because they're youths. It's not because they're white. Hundreds of white youths are not killed in crack wars and gangbanging every year. Only whites could take Clinton's comments seriously, and they do. Clinton, by the way, that Sister Souljah thing, I think, was the turning point of this election. every time Dukakis appeared in 1988 with Jesse Jackson, his polls went down from 3 to 5 points. After the convention with Jackson on a lot, straight down. Clinton went to the Rainbow Coalition and managed to gain 10 points in the polls based on going to visit Jesse Jackson's forces. And he gained it exactly among white voters. And he did it very shrewdly with this attack on Sister Souljah. But the Sister Souljah incident also ought to alert us to the fact that we need not just give up and capitulate to whiteness. The Rainbow Coalition, before which Clinton spoke, mobilized tens of thousands of whites, not only around its social democratic politics, but around the idea that the fight against Reaganism should include people of color as central constituencies and as the leaders. The Rainbow's most striking success in moving young white workers to act on the perception that the fighting style of the Black Freedom Movement was more appropriate to their plight than anything in white politics, its mobilizing of masses of Midwestern auto workers in the 1988 election, did not, it is true, always translate into votes. The Rainbow's disorganization, its lack of democracy, and its timidity, combined with the continuing power of race thinking among whites to limit the extent that white workers entered politics as non-whites. But the possibility that they could do so within an organization, a black-led organization agitating on both class and race issues, was clearly present. 7 to 10% of white workers voted for Jackson in those primaries. We may suspect, moreover, that more white people strongly appreciate Sister Souljah than Bill Clinton. Okay, I wrote this in Ghana. It's probably wrong, but at that time I thought it might be true. And I still think there's a little bit to it, that more white people, or a lot of white people, young white people, appreciate Sister Souljah as much as they appreciate Bill Clinton. At least they're much more likely to buy her records than they are to buy Bill Clinton's records. The tremendous popularity of hip-hop music and style among white youth has been written off as a fascination with violence and sexism among very young white suburban males. But the attraction is much broader than that. Rappers with varying messages appeal to male and female, middle and working class whites from grade school to adulthood, even into middle age like myself. Unlike rock, which brought whites to African American music but quickly diluted the black influence on that music and threw up white performers as the most celebrated stars, hip-hop is embraced by whites without any sharp tendency to take it over. I mean, even your 7-year-old knows that Vanilla Ice is a joke, right? I mean, it's now the 5-year-olds who buy Vanilla Ice albums. There's not going to be a Pat Boone of hip-hop. Or if it is, it's going to be authentic white performers like House of Pain, who are really learning African American culture. In this, hip-hop more nearly parallels white working class attraction to soul music in the 1960s and 1970s. See, by all means, The Commitments, and perhaps to reggae. Hip-hop offers white youth not only spontaneity, experimentation, humor, danger, sexuality, physical movement, and rebellion, absent from what passes as white culture, but it also offers an explicit, often harsh critique of whiteness. And young white people are hearing that critique of whiteness, and they don't mind that it's harsh. They're ready to hear it. Of course, it would be ridiculous to claim that every white hip-hop fan is finding a way out of whiteness, let alone out of racism. There's not going to be any simple fix for the white problem, and that's what it is. It's not a black problem, it's a white problem. There's not going to be any simple fix for the white problem in America, and it is well to emphasize limits as well as possibilities. The Guido subculture in Italian-American New York City, well described in the recent writings of Donald Tricarico and in the films of Spike Lee, stands as an ambiguous example of both the possibilities and the limits of getting rid of whiteness. Guidos have adopted hip-hop, many of them are great rappers, and asserted a distinctive Italian-American identity as against white American wannabes. They criticize their middle-class friends as being wannabes. They refer to themselves as guineas, turning that anti-Italian and anti-black slur into a badge of honor in the same way that rappers reclaim the word nigger. Italian-American rappers are reclaiming the word guinea. But the break with whiteness and racism on New York City streets is obviously less than complete. As Tricarico nicely understates it, in many ways, Guidos resist identification with black youth and bite the hand that feeds them style. No easy answer. Historically, too, last page, the use of an often distorted image of African American life to express criticisms of white culture or longings for a different way of life has not been necessarily a way around racism. Actually, the minstrel show expressed longings of white people to embrace black culture and to learn about black culture, but still expressed racism and lots that was horrible at the same time, in almost a perfect illustration of Herman Melville's wise observation that, quote, envy and antipathy, passions irreconcilable in reason, nevertheless may spring conjoined in one birth. You wouldn't think people could be envious and hateful at the same time, but sure enough, they can be. And when whites come to black culture, very often they are coming with a sense of envy and a sense of hatred. When a resident in an Italian Slavic neighborhood in Connecticut, quoted in Ivan Greenberg's recent fine dissertation, told a WPA interviewer in the 1930s that, quote, the nigger people have a holiday every day of the week, envy and hatred run right through a comment like this. In some ways, in fact, the greater that the envy and longing has been, the greater has been the need to reassert whiteness and white supremacy. Narr, as Norman Mailer showed both deliberately and unwittingly in The White Negro, has the use of African American culture to critique whiteness come without superficiality and paternalism. Loss of whiteness can have the beauty it does in a film like John Harris's Hairspray, or the vapid arrogance it does in a terrible film like Soul Man. Anybody see Soul Man? Oh, admit it. Somebody's seen it. And these extremes exist not just among, but within individual whites. Not just a case of they're hip whites and they're whites that aren't hip. This is fought inside whites, not just among whites. Finally, there's a sense in which whites can't renounce their whiteness even if they want to. The Italian-American heroine, at least I think she's the heroine, Spike Lee didn't like her that much, in Jungle Fever, is as exemplary a race traitor as any seen on the big screen within memory. But those of you who've seen Jungle Fever will know that when the cops come, she's still treated as a white person. She's done a lot to shed her whiteness, but in the eyes of the cops, she's still treated as white. But even given all these problems and limits, we can't afford to ignore the political implications of the mass questioning of whiteness as a trend and a possibility in the United States. In a variety of settings, including even in the David Duke campaign, whites are confessing that they're confused about whether it's really worth the effort to be white. We need to say loudly and clearly that it's not worth it and that many of us do not want to do it. Initiatives against a Duke or a Bush should not only be class-oriented and anti-racist, but also, in a sense, explicitly anti-white. Well, I've already backed off of that. Non-white. With a central focus on exposing how whiteness is used to make whites settle for hopelessness in politics and alienation in everyday life. When a Clinton panders to whiteness, we should not let him off the hook on the grounds that his comments are only arguably racist, as currently defined. Our opposition should focus on contrasting the bankruptcy of white politics with the possibilities of non-whiteness. We should point out not just that whites and people of color often have common economic interests, but that people of color currently act on those interests far more consistently in politics, in unions, at the workplace, and in community-based environmental struggles, precisely because they act more consistently on those interests because they are not burdened by whiteness. We should transform reverse racism from a curse into a rallying cry. Reverse racism, exclamation point. Campaigning for expanded affirmative action on the grounds of both justice and the need to remove the privileges which encourage people to keep on being white. If even MTV realizes that there is a mass audience for the critique of whiteness, we cannot fail to nurture a constituency committed to its full abolition. Thank you. I ran on considerably, and I guess what I'd like to do with Jacqueline and John's permission, is just hang around here and take individual questions. Is that agreeable to people? I'll stay, but I realize that many of you were coerced into coming and you have other things to do.